Désactiver l'option environnement et participants. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on ESG compliance, focusing specifically on the development of an environmental, social and governance manual and toolkit for African mini-grids. We'll wait still for a few minutes because to give time for everybody to connect and to join this webinar. Thank you all very much for joining, and I hope it will be an exciting morning. All right. I hope that everybody has managed to connect to the webinar by now. We'll start with an introduction to the agenda. This webinar is going to last for about an hour and a half, with the first 15 minutes on introduction and introduction of the partners. We will then move on to introducing the Environmental, Social and Governance Compliance Manual and Toolkit, provide an overview of the manual that we have prepared. We will then move on to the toolkit itself for practitioners and introduce the 4 training sessions ahead. We'll end with concluding remarks and questions and discussions. Next slide, please. So what is this all about? We have prepared a practical environmental, social and governance guidebook targeting mini-grid practitioners and addressing the specificities of the mini-grid sector in Africa. The rationale for doing this is that we are in a context where mini-grids clearly are central to closing Africa's energy access gap. So there is a challenge in multiplying pretty fast the number of mini-grids we commit. This is a practical guide for developers who are seeking international finance, so to help comply with the ESG guidance, which is provided by the international finance community. It is written for field practitioners and environmental and social managers. It's not for ESG experts. The idea also is to provide an approach which is proportionate to project size and risk, and also paired with a ready-to-use toolkit. So with that, I would like to thank our partners for allowing us to do this work. This work has been supported by the African Development Bank, by the IFC, and for the communications by ARE, and we, IED, were entrusted with preparing these documents. So I would like now to hand over to Gabriele from the African Development Bank.
Yes, thank you very much, Anjali, for this introduction, and yeah, a very warm welcome and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And a very warm welcome, as I said, to today's presentation of this very important capacity building initiative, which aims to support mini-grid developers in Africa in managing environmental, social and governance, or in short, ESG risks and complying with international ESG standards. And Anjali already mentioned it, this initiative has been developed and funded by the African Development Bank through the Sustainable Energy for Africa, or in short SEFA, under its TA program, the Africa Mini-Grid Market Acceleration Program, or AMAP. And it was developed in partnership with colleagues from IFC and the Alliance for Renewable Electrification. Just briefly, very briefly on SEFA and AMAP, I'm sure most of you have already heard about us. SEFA is a multi-donor fund administered by the AfDB, providing catalytic finance and technical assistance to help unlock private sector investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency projects in Africa. SEFA's very specific TA program AMAP is as a part of SEFA and focuses specifically on scaling up the mini-grid sector by supporting a private sector-led market and promoting access to finance for mini-grid developers. Through SEFA's engagement with developers, one challenge has clearly emerged. Many companies, especially the smaller early-stage developers, struggle to meet the increasingly stringent ESG risk management and reporting requirements of investors. These include frameworks such as the bank's own integrated safeguard system, as well as the IFC performance standards. These are the biggest standards that are widely used in the sector. At the same time, these frameworks are critical. They are widely used by development finance institutions and private investors, making them essential for accessing finance. So based on consistent feedback from across the sector, AfDB, IFC, and ARE have therefore joined forces and addressed this capacity gap through this TA initiative. The key challenges that we are trying to address are threefold. First, the ESG frameworks were largely designed for larger scale infrastructure projects, but are often applied equally to smaller mini-grid developers who may not have the same level of resources and capacity to comply with these standards. Second, developers must often comply with different ESG requirements from different investors, varying indicators, methodologies, and reporting formats. So this increases complexity and also the administrative burden on the developers. And thirdly, many developers operate within limited human and financial resources, making it difficult to dedicate sufficient capacity to ESG compliance. This in turn can limit also their ability to access financing. So in response, this initiative clearly aims to provide very practical user-friendly guidance to help developers to better understand and apply key ESG standards with an initial focus on the AfDB's ISS and the IFC performance standards. We tried to develop user-friendly tools and materials that support compliance and promote the adoption of these tools across the sector. We will also conduct and deliver training sessions to build the capacity within the sector and also promote the wide adoption of these tools across the sector. A key message that we also want to emphasize is that ESG risk management and impact reporting should not be seen purely as a compliance exercise and a big additional burden on the companies. Instead, they are powerful tools to improve project performance, strengthen stakeholder relationships, reduce risks, and ultimately enhance the ability to access financing. So with the support of EUD Consult and extensive stakeholder engagement, we have developed an ESG compliance manual and toolkit to help developers navigate and apply these standards in practice. So today we are very pleased to present the initial outputs of these, or initial versions of these materials. They will be further refined over the coming weeks based on feedback from a broad range of stakeholders, including from this webinar. And in addition, we will host 4 dedicated training sessions in the coming weeks. And Anjali and her team, they will provide more information on these training sessions. So with this, I will hand over to my colleague from IFC, Mathilde, for additional remarks. And I wish you all a very insightful and very engaging webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriele, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of IFC for the launch of this guidance manual and tool for ESG. So this initiative was supported through IFC's M300 DRE program, which provides targeted short to mid-term pre-investment support to DRE companies in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think we all agree here that mini-grids have a critical role to play in achieving universal energy access across Africa. Yet, despite the sector's huge potential, mobilizing the level of investment needed to scale remains one of its greatest challenges. And if we are honest, ESG has often been seen mainly as like requirements companies need to comply with in order to secure financing. A report to submit, a document to prepare, and if we're being very honest, a document that may end up sitting in a drawer and never being read again. So for developers operating with lean teams and limited resources, ESG requirements can sometimes feel a bit disconnected from day-to-day operational realities. However, the reality is that ESG is much more than a compliance exercise. Many of the challenges that mini-grid developers face every day are in fact ESG challenges. We can name a few of them: security, community acceptance, worker safety, engaging with local stakeholders, managing supply chain risks. So projects and companies that address these issues well tend to experience fewer delays, fewer disputes, and stronger long-term performance. And from an investor perspective like IFC and AfDB, strong ESG practices are often a sign of a well-managed company. So they help build confidence, they help improve predictability, and in the end, they make projects more investable. So this matters because our objective here at IFC is not ESG compliance for its own sake, but to help accelerate investment into the mini-grid space and support its scale-up across Africa. To attract larger volumes of capital, the sector needs projects that are not only technically sound and financially viable, but also capable of managing ESG risks effectively. The challenge, therefore, here is twofold: maintaining robust standards while ensuring they remain practical and proportionate for growing companies operating with limited resources. And this is exactly the purpose of the work that has been done over the last few months, and that is being presented today. So not to dilute ESG ambition, but to make implementation more practical, more proportionate, and in the end, more useful. So through this toolkit, the objective has been to translate what can sometimes feel like abstract standards into practical tools, templates, checklists, graduated approaches, and operational examples that developers can integrate into their everyday activities. So ultimately, we hope that these resources will help developers strengthen their operations, improve access to financing, build stronger relationships with communities, and support the sustainable growth of the sector. So to conclude, I would like to sincerely thank the AfDB team, array team, and the project team at EAD, and all stakeholders who contributed their expertise and time to this initiative. Thank you all for joining us today, and I wish you an excellent webinar.
Good morning, everyone. Also, a warm welcome to everyone from the ARE side. Just before we dive into the topical discussions, a quick word from our side about the new ARE as well, and how this initiative fits in our strategy. Many of you know us as the Alliance for Rural Education, ARE, and as we celebrate our 20th anniversary this year, we have evolved into something new. So now we are the Alliance for Renewable Electrification, reflecting how the energy sector itself is changing. Our scope is broader now, for example, including CNI, but let me reassure everyone in this call that energy access, mini-grids and rural electrification remains the cornerstone of everything we do at ARE. And this webinar and broader TA initiative on ESG for mini-grids is a perfect example of that. It in many ways reflects exactly the kind of collaboration that we in ARE strongly believe in. Bringing private sector voices alongside leading sector institutions to create tools and guides for the industry. Things that are grounded in the realities in the field and address the real needs of companies in this sector. And the needs are very real. We hear it from our members consistently. So as late as the recent EIF in Nairobi in April, mini-grid developers and operators across Africa are wrestling with complex, sometimes overlapping ESG compliance requirements from investors. Navigating these requirements while scaling, getting projects financed, and keeping operations running is definitely no small feat. So this toolkit is AfDB SEFA, IFC, and ARE's collective answer to that challenge. And the key aim that I'd like to reiterate is to make life simpler and easier for mini-grid developers. So we sincerely hope that the tools developed and that you will see presented today are genuinely useful for you and help companies live up to criteria that investors and regulators expect. All of the toolkits you'll see presented will be hosted on ARE's website on a dedicated project hub, will remain operational. So the resource stays accessible to the whole sector well beyond the timeline of today and this specific the specific webinars and trainings. And of course, I can't resist to also quickly pitch joining the Alliance for those few mini-grid investors, operators that are not yet members. We do warmly encourage you to join ARE as a member. You can discuss that with myself or any part of the team. And this sort of collaboration today is a good reflection of what membership makes possible. So we'd love to hear your voice in the room as well as we should shape what comes next. And I think that's enough from my side. I hand it back over to Anjali to run the specific discussions. Thank you very much. Have a nice webinar.
Thank you all very much for this very warm welcome and framing the challenges that lie ahead of us. As we go along, I would like to encourage everybody to put up your questions in the chat. There is a specific chat, if you see on the top right, with a question mark, a sort of a flag with a question mark. So please put up your questions over there, and we'll put them all together and answer them maybe collectively at the end of the webinar, or possibly when we finish each one of the sections. So this is just a first of a series of presentations. So we're having the webinar today in French, in English, and tomorrow in French. These webinars are being recorded and will be available on the ARE platform. As Gabriele also stated, we are still in the last activities of finalizing the guidebook and the toolkits. These will be available, I think, towards mid-July or end July, and will be readily accessible on the ARE website. So with this introduction, let me now dive into what this guidebook and toolkits are all about. Well, first of all, what is the reality of mini-grids today? We all heard that there is a tremendous challenge in scaling up. Let's put a few figures there. The reality today of mini-grids, looking at statistics from AMDA and ARE in particular, is that a typical installed capacity is around 100 kilowatt peaks per site, with average connections per site under 500 people. And the revenue, which is a very important ballpark figure to have in mind, tend to be between $1,000 and $4,000 per month. So this tells us basically what kind of OPEX and in particular HR for ESG is actually available for one site. So this guide basically covers how to approach individual mini-grids. I would just like to highlight here that after discussions, we are focusing on solar mini-grids. We are not looking at other renewable energy technologies. This may be a challenge for the next work. These individual solar mini-grids actually serve rural villages, so there is a mini-grid associated with generation. The size, as we said, is typically 20 to 500 kilowatt peaks. And just to give another ballpark figure, we are not talking about huge challenges in terms of land. Generally, we're between 0.1 and 0.2 hectares for 100 kilowatt peak. Now, obviously, when we talk about scaling up and when we look at the transaction costs of the donor community and the international finance community, one has to move towards a portfolio approach. When we look at the reality today, developers would typically manage 10 to maybe 150 sites. But as Gabriele said, we did extensive stakeholder engagement with the support of ARE, reaching out to all of ARE members. And the result of the stakeholder engagement showed us basically that most developers have a maximum of 15 to 35 sites. A lot have less than 5 sites, and only one of those we had a discussion with had more than 150 sites. So this also poses the question of aggregating the number of sites to reach the size which a national donor would be willing to approach. How this relates to ESG compliance issues. Obviously, the tools that we have now developed would also apply to metro grids of a scale of about 1 megawatt peak. Next slide, please. Okay, so this guide is intended to be used by practitioners to meet their needs. So what it is and what it is not. As was already stated extensively, developers must meet environment, social, and government requirements in order to secure finance and also to obtain national permits. As again was also stated, these standards were designed for large infrastructure, not small portfolio-based mini-grids. So we try and see now how we can interpret them and apply them in a practical way to the mini-grid situation. So the goal of this manual is to fill the gap and to provide practical, proportionate guidance tailored to the sector. So what it is not, it is not a donor tick boxing exercise. It's also not an academic standards textbook, and it's not a one-size-fits-all compliance burden. Of course, one still has to adjust to the reality of the field, and it does not replace national permitting processes, because national regulators, of course, have their own way of doing things and their own requirements. Next slide, please. Just as a quick reminder, what are these ESG safeguards and standards that we're talking about? Of course, I won't quote them all, but I quote those which are the most generally used, those of the IFC performance standards, and those of the African Development Bank, the AfDB operational safeguards. Sorry, the title wasn't changed to OS. So when one looks through these standards and safeguards, one sees that they are really absolutely converging. The first with three differences, basically. The African Development Bank safeguards insists particularly on stakeholder engagement, which is the operational safeguard number 10. In the IFC performance standard, this is included in performance standard 1, assessment and management of environmental and social risk. African Development Bank makes a difference between these two, and we'll see as we go through what is suggested in the guidance that stakeholder engagement really is one of the cornerstones of successful and sustainable mini-grid management and implementation. The African Development Bank also focuses specifically on broader vulnerable groups than just indigenous people. So here I'm talking about number 7, where in the IFC performance standards, one talks specifically about indigenous people, and African Development Banks takes a broader take on vulnerable groups with indigenous people within it. There also is a specific operational standard in the African Development Bank for financial intermediaries. Otherwise, both cover risk assessment and management, labor working conditions, resource efficiency, community health, safety and security. And we'll see as we move towards implementation that these 4 standards absolutely converged with achieving the impact that we want to achieve and the sustainability we want to achieve within the mini-grid sector. We then have the standards covering land acquisition and involuntary resettlement, biodiversity conservation, indigenous people, and cultural heritage. Not that these standards are not important. Of course, they are absolutely crucially important. But what we need to assess in very concrete terms is how affordable it is for a mini-grid developer to address these if they are triggered in any kind of a major way. Next slide, please. So with this introduction, what I would also like to highlight is that environmental, social, and government approaches and standards actually apply throughout the project lifecycle. During the first stages of concept and planning, there are challenges, like going through the due diligence. And the success of a mini-grid actually goes with engaging right from the start with the communities. So what we find is that if right at the concept and planning stage, one has a comprehensive stakeholder engagement plan, this really makes all the implementation stage so much more easier. So this is really one of the big convergences with between impact and development of mini-grid and the ESG approach. During implementation, as we see, there is a lot of monitoring which is done through the ESMP, looking at stakeholder engagement, but also waste management, also human resources and security, which are crucial to acceptance and security during the implementation of the mini-grid. At closure, of course, we want to make sure that we don't leave behind too much waste. So the whole issue of recycling is extremely important, as is the issue of waste management during construction at the initial phases. Next slide, please. So how do ESG practices contribute to mitigate operational risks? So our goal is to generate reliable power, to achieve new connections and economies of scale. Now, how do our ESG practices serve those goals? Well, first of all, to achieve scale, we need access to finance and permits. So we need ESG compliance, of course, to secure those funds in a positive way. We also want to lower risks and costs. So managing ESG improves risk control and reduces cost over time. For example, if we have proper stakeholder engagement right from the beginning, the risk of conflict is reduced. Also, the technical risks are reduced. Implementing an ESG approach right at the beginning for one site, the whole idea there is to plan ESG early and to conceive a monitoring system that will serve each and every site. To add something else that we got from stakeholders also expressed that when we have multiple donors, sometimes the multiple donors have different monitoring frameworks. So one important challenge is, even if it takes a little bit more time, is to agree at the start on a unique monitoring system which will be acceptable for all the donors financing the specific mini-grid or portfolio of mini-grid. Impact and performance. Strong ESG performance converges with long-term impact and commercial success. We'll go to that now in terms of achieving a higher number of connections and impact in terms of productive uses. So the challenge is to make all this ESG management cost-effective and practical for mini-grid practitioners. This is what the manual is all about. Next slide, please. So how do these ESG practices drive commercial performances? So one key performance indicator for a mini-grid developer, investor, practitioner is to have as high a number of connections as possible. Just having a 10% penetration rate is not a good way of thinking about the viability of the mini-grid. Now, ESG can support this with a proper stakeholder engagement plan right from the start. One key and delicate issue always is tariff transparency and the way that the tariff is implemented. I mean, all of us being practitioners know the challenges between kilowatt hour prices and cost for service. So having proper stakeholder engagement and information really is a key to avoiding conflict and building ownership locally. Having an effective grievance redress mechanism builds customer confidence so that people don't feel left out, and we make sure that there are no gender-based challenges. And community engagement will drive the uptake, basically, of electricity and connections. So on the right-hand side column, we say which standards this basically relates to. Basically, this is performance standard 1, operational safeguard number 1 and 10 for the AfDB. Another performance indicator, of course, which is important for us, is the revenue per customer. So if right at the start we have a proper framework for doing the socioeconomic surveys, this will help in revealing willingness to pay. Not that developers don't do these surveys, but this is basically also a convergence of the ESG requirements. This also helps right from the start to focus on productive uses and gender-inclusive outreach in order to increase energy demand, to identify what these productive uses are all about. We all know that productive uses is easier said than done and implies different kinds of accompanying financing and management. But with proper integration right from the start, we can achieve this quicker and reach viability quicker. Another challenge is to reduce non-technical losses and theft. So this can positively be achieved if the community really feels it owns the whole system, and that they feel that pilferage, stealing cables and so on and so forth, all kinds of misuse will not serve the ultimate goal of uplifting the community. This is where we also have other convergences between what we want to achieve in terms of impact and ESG. So having our community liaison officer with an on-site community liaison presence is really very important. We also want to achieve service availability. So therefore, having a proper, transparent and effective system in terms of incident reporting, feedback channels, make faults surface early and emergency plans, corrective measures can be implemented quickly, reduce downtime, and avoid frustration from clients. Also, looking at some of the technical aspects of the ESG framework, the idea then is that we also increase the life of assets, batteries and gensets, as well as recycling and environmental management and protection. We also avoid regulatory sanctions, as the case may be. Next slide, please. So basically, what we're driving at is that ESG practices address the same operational risks and determine whether a mini-grid succeeds commercially. Yep. Now, what are the challenges with ESG categorizations? We've all heard about the categories A, B, and C as regards the corrective measures, which then would need to be applied. What we have tried to do over here is to make ESMS requirements proportionate with project risk level and project size. So we have to be manageable. As we said in the introduction, we have subdivided our approach into 3 levels. The level 1.1 being either a single site or a small cluster. So here we are talking about less than 500 kilowatt peaks. These are, of course, not cast in stone, but the idea is to give a ballpark figure with a portfolio revenue of less than $50,000 per month. So in this case, the ESG has to be run by the project team and the commercial team in the field. It seems difficult to imagine that one could have a specialist basically implementing all the ESG requirements. And this is the reason why we need standard templates to cover the core requirements. And very often, a dedicated environmental and social officer often is not available. In this case, we would be basically targeting a risk category C, which is a low category, where we can avoid having deep specialist analysis and having safeguards which can be quite costly. We'll go into that later, but we propose to have a screening approach wherein if we know that we have a small portfolio, it's much better to exclude those sites which would entail high costs if the risks are considered high and if we feel that there is a risk that we move to a category B. Now, level 1.2, when we talk about a portfolio of mini-grids, here we are talking about revenues which are over $50,000 per month. And when we have a larger number of sites, 15 to 30 sites perhaps. So in this case, a full-time ENS manager would be required and is affordable. The advantage of having this full-time manager is that we can improve as we go, meaning all the reports that are produced from each one of the sites from the standard templates, which are also proposed in the toolkit, would then be analyzed by this ENS manager, both from the perspective of ESG, but also from the perspective of the performance of the grid. And the idea is to do continuous improvement, converging with the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle of the ESG system. In this case, we can have stronger documentation and monitoring. Well, if we can remain at a level C, we would probably prefer that. B plus generally means that we could have some additional safeguards which are required, but at this level, these have to remain proportionate with the size and the income which is generated and would obviously be possible. For larger investments, meaning larger portfolios and a metro grid, well, a metro grid is a single site, so we don't have this issue of having to analyze each individual site separately. So in this case, of course, one would go ahead with a comprehensive ESMS, probably having an on-site health, safety, and environmental manager during construction at least. And it is possible, given the size of the investment and the land and other potential issues, maybe biodiversity, that specialist assessments may be required. So chances are that we would fall into a B plus or B category. So the ABCs, of course, are the IFC category, and these basically relate to the category 1, 2, 3 of the African Development Bank. So clearly what we are stating over here is that we have to have a good screening process given the size of the investments that we're talking about. Next slide, please. In other words, the approach that we propose is a screening approach, meaning that if we find that the risk of a small cluster of mini-grid is too high, we are better off screening them out, or to make sure that we have the resources to manage the risks. In any case, the general operations will be managed during the lifetime of the project. So basically, major challenges related to land acquisition and resettlement, related to biodiversity and sensitive habitats, related to indigenous people issues, related to cultural and sacred heritage. The suggestion over here is to really, with a strong stakeholder engagement, make sure that these challenges are identified at the very early stage, at the very early screening stage, and that we be realistic, either by excluding them, unfortunately, or being realistic about the fact that specific specialist support would be required, in which case one should also be realistic about the fact that dedicated grant financing will be needed, because if we're talking about a turnover of $10,000 per month or whatever, it's obvious, you know, that high expenses at the early stage would not be available, would not be affordable, nor would the implementation of these safeguards be affordable. Nonetheless, what needs to be managed throughout construction and operations are the major cornerstones of the viability of the mini-grids, which relate to stakeholder engagement and information disclosure. We already explained earlier on, you know, issues related to tariff, productive uses, and so on and so forth. Obviously, labor and working conditions are extremely important, especially in those remote areas where we don't want to be challenged with forced labor, child labor, including in the supply chain. So we do know that this may be a challenge, but it's important that if we subcontract to an EPC contractor, or if the developer is not the EPC contractor itself, that we make sure that all these obligations are passed on. Community health, safety, and security also are extremely important for the long-term viability of the system, and these systems have to be put into place practically, not too complicated, but right from the start to ensure long-term viability. And as we explained, and we'll have case studies later on as we go into the trainings, resource efficiency, meaning avoiding things like line losses or early loss of lifetime in the batteries related to the heat conditions or ventilation, etc., are extremely important, both from the point of view of environmental impact and long-term sustainability. So there again, we see a convergence. Next slide, please. So in the case of mini-grids, stakeholder engagement and waste management really are the cornerstone of sustainability, and these we feel are the environment, the standards which need to be addressed and taken on board systematically. Now, once we've done this screening, an environmental and social management system has to be put into place. So there, what we would suggest is that for a mini-grid developer, it really does make sense, maybe hopefully taking inspiration from the toolkit that we will be sharing with you, that you adapt this toolkit, adapt it to what your business is all about, and have a sort of a standard management system that you will apply to each one of your sites or to each one of your portfolios. So given that this may be very obvious to a number of people in this webinar, and I apologize for that, but some people may be less familiar with what an ESMS, as one calls it, basically entails. The first step in implementing an ESMS is basically a policy statement. Policy statement comes from the top management of the company, and it's, again, the idea is not to have just a tick box exercise where you just have that paper and you file it somewhere, but the idea is that the CEO and the management of the company really builds ownership into that and communicates and conveys to the team that this policy is something which is important for the company and that it is a cornerstone to long-term sustainability, and then growing the company if we want to be able to sustain ourselves and to mobilize more international finance. The second stage in this ESMS is risk identification, which we have talked about just a little while ago. So identifying those risks which we think would maybe be too costly for a specific site or a specific cluster to manage. Not to say that we necessarily directly exclude it, like if, for example, for good reasons, we want to develop a mini-grid in a protected area, dealing with all the biodiversity challenges would probably require a specialist study and special safeguards, but it just means that we have to be cognizant of the fact that this will require resources and costs and make sure that we have them available before embarking and hitting a wall that we won't be able to cross, or a river we won't be able to cross. So this is presented in the tool, in our toolkit 1.1, this risk identification process of the ESMS. Once these risks are identified, management programs should be formulated with a mitigation plan for each one of the identified risks. So there may be major risks, but also basic risks like emergency preparedness and response, and a few basic things which really have to be there in each one of the mini grids or cluster of the mini grids, because this again builds comfort and confidence within the local mini grid community. This is then detailed in the tools 3.2, 3.4. Step number 4 then, once we have identified the risks and the management programs, we have to make sure that we have an organizational structure which is affordable and which can implement all what we've been wanting to implement, basically. It's important to assign responsibilities, define who does what, and at the early stages to train. So, for example, the operational manager who's pretty used to tracking sales, for example, if on the template of tracking sales, we add a few indications regarding the profile of the customer, whether the customer is a lady, what kind of a community the customer comes from, whether they are prospects for developing productive uses. If all this is reported, then we converge between reporting for the mini-grid management and for ESG, and hopefully for longer-term sustainability. As mentioned earlier, which is also more specific aspect of the management program, we have the emergency preparedness. Now, here again, we remain proportionate with mini-grids. Emergency preparedness should be something which is extremely simple, maybe just a 1 A4 poster saying what needs to be done in the case of accidents or electrocution or whatever, but having this neat and tidy in the mini-grid area, again, builds confidence, makes the quality of management improve, people being proud of what they're doing, and builds also investor confidence when they come and visit the sites and see that all this has been anticipated and prepared for. Very important, we've talked about it a lot already, is stakeholder engagement. So for that, we have specific tools which are proposed as to how to engage with stakeholders. When we were consulting in order to develop this, what came across quite strongly is a wish to basically see how one can address the IP, indigenous peoples issues, which require specific approaches, and it's maybe not the mainstay of a mini-grid developer or operator who is about producing electricity. So the gender approach plus the IP approach is given a special focus in the tool that we will share with you, these tools 2.2 and 2.1. In order to achieve all of that, it has to be monitored through KPIs. So a monitoring toolkit there is also offered. So this tells you basically what is in the ESMS and in the toolkit. Next slide, please. So with this, we've gone through the overview of the ESG guidebook and how it relates to this toolkit for practitioners. Now, regarding this toolkit, I will just, on the next slide, please, introduce how we have organized these toolkits. And I will now hand over to Marie, who will give you the overall introduction to the toolkits and the 11 tools that we have developed. As I said, really focusing on what we feel are the main risks which really need to be addressed for the mini-grids. And she will walk you through two of what we think are cornerstones of the analysis we have to go through for mini-grids. Over to you, Marie.
Thank you so much, Anjali, and thank you, everyone. So the idea of this toolkit is really to help you navigate the risks, starting really step by step, starting with the screening that will help you identify and fill, if needed, extremely quickly. Then you move on to the stakeholder engagement and rights. As we said, stakeholder engagement is extremely important. It's one of the reasons of the success or not of a project. And then you move on to, let's say, the operations. So something a little bit more practical that is kind of anchored into the growth of the mini-grid. So you'll see that on the you have the numbers of the various tools really organized by the various features of these mini-grids. One is, so the series with starting with 1 is really on the screening and reporting. The series starting with 2 is on the stakeholder engagement and rights. And the third is about ESMS and operations, so environmental monitoring and operations. Next slide, please. So let's start with the screening checklist, because it's the first thing you'll use and probably the cheapest to get it right. Here's the problem it solves. So normally, the moment you discover a, let's say, fatal flaw within a site, whether it's a protected habitat or people who've been displaced or an indigenous community, is when the full impact studies comes back. But by then, you've already spent months and a lot of money on that site. So this checklist moves that moment to the very, very, very beginning. At site selection, before you commit resource or time or money, you run a handful of red flag questions. And 5 of them are already on this slide. Next slide, please. So the one is on the land and resettlement. Is there a physical or economic displacement? In case yes, you must avoid or minimize but you must document every land agreement. It's like a memo. You remember that you must document everything. On biodiversity, is it near a protected area or a key biodiversity area? It's a no-go for a level 1, but it might be you must use other tools like ABAT or national maps. On the indigenous people and communities, so the PS7 or OS7, are indigenous people present? It's a no-go unless some specialist support is available. And the cultural heritage, you must ask, is there a burial grounds, shrines, or sacred sites? Then you screen with the community and also add a change find protocol. And then on the climate hazard, is there exposure to flooding or extreme heat, for instance? It means that the site design must include hazard mitigation. So it's a it's a go or no-go gate. It's a gate. And it also feeds your own risk categorization. So the whole point is very simple. You fail fast and cheaply on the wrong side, so you can move on with confidence on the right ones, okay? And once the site passes this first screening, the work shifts to engagement. And that's the second tool I will present very quickly now.
Sorry, Marine, just jumping in. Just a heads up to all the participants in the webinar. Please feel free to put in comments, questions, or suggestions in the chat so that we can have a conversation towards the end of the webinar.
Or, of course, case study. If you have ever encountered such a challenge at an early stage, or if it came later, that's always interesting for us too. Then next slide, please. Then we move on to 2.1, which is about stakeholder engagement. The stakeholder engagement plan, it answers 3 questions: who, when, and how. Who? You must map everyone affected: women, the youth, generally speaking, the users too often left out, and not only the most visible representatives, such as the chiefs, the elders, or the local authorities. The when is about you must start when you select the site, but you also must review every 6 months and update quite quickly within 30 days of any material change. I know 30 days is short, but in the long run, you won't feel it to be so short after all. And the how, it's about the disclosure that's accessible and culturally appropriate, with meeting times and venues chosen so that women and minorities can actually attend. It's extremely important to build the inclusion part from the design and not afterwards. For instance, you must separate women's consultation when they're needed and also have female liaison officers who consistently reach more women. And it connects straight to the grievance mechanisms in 2.2 that includes a confidential channel for sensitive cases such as SEAH based to sexual harassment. The test to remember is, did the consultation actually influence the decision? If not, you must record why and explain it to the people affected. Now, over to you, Anjali.
Okay, so thank you very much, Marine, for walking us through these 2 toolkits. This is just a sort of a little teaser of what our toolkits are all about. The toolkits, as you've seen, really aim at being very practical and tailored to mini-grid issues. So as we go now towards the training sessions ahead of us, the idea during the training sessions then is that we want them to be interactive, where we will go practically through the toolkits, walking the participants through the toolkits and going through practical case studies. If you have practical case studies or challenges to share, where the challenges which have occurred during the due diligence phase or during the project implementation stage, the sharing would really be more than welcome. In discussing with the ARE, African Development Bank, and the IFC, the idea now was to organize these training sessions. Now, unfortunately, we would very much have liked to do them in person, but this is now going to be the first test run where we are going to do them online, and hopefully at a later stage could be done in person in the countries, because training obviously is much more interesting when it is done in person. In any case, based on the extensive stakeholder consultations we did, the discussions with the African Development Bank as well as the IFC, we decided to subdivide these into 4 sessions upon the recommendation of ARE as well. So these will be hands-on, practice-oriented, and related to the actual implementation of the manual and the toolkit. Session number 1 will be held on June 10th. This will focus and walk us through the realities of mini-grids, looking into the challenges which are actually being faced by the mini-grid practitioners. It will then walk through the ESG Compliance Manual and Toolkit into some level of detail, and we will then go into the risk analysis and screening for site selection, which is what Marine has talked about just now. It will obviously start with a little bit of a questionnaire for all the participants to express what their priorities and their needs are, and we will strive to ensure that we can answer all the questions which are asked throughout this training session. So this would be held on the 10th of June, and it will be in English. For the webinars, we are having one in English today, another one in French tomorrow, but the trainings will be only in English. After this first training session, we then move on to the second training session. The second training session, again, case study based, will really focus on all the tools as related to stakeholder engagement. So the various tools we have, the approaches to stakeholder engagement, and the focuses, which are really important for the sustainability of mini-grids, meaning integrating gender issues, integrating indigenous people issues, and also making sure that labor, health and safety are well addressed, that we are compliant at least with national law, but also ILO standards. Addressing also, and in discussion with practitioners, how one can have a practical grievance mechanism. Of course, if one is talking about, small sites with 400 or 500 people, so 100 connections, one cannot afford to have a very detailed grievance mechanism, but how to make sure that it is really to the point and meets the challenges of the specific community. Are those related to gender-based violence, to exclusion of certain communities, to land-based issues, etc., etc.? We try and make these grievance mechanisms as practical and affordable as possible. So this is what the second session is going to be, also relating all this stakeholder engagement with the impacts that we are looking for. The impacts being increased standards of living, so productive uses, social end uses, and also improvement of the living conditions of the targeted population. So session 2 will focus on these challenges. Session 3 will be on the exclusion list that Marine just talked about. So deep diving now into land issues that we have. So land issues, of course, can be pretty challenging because we have the traditional authorities in various areas. So how to handle this issue of traditional rights and official law. So this is something we'll deep dive into, seeing how this can be addressed through case studies, experience sharing. As regards biodiversity, of course, there is tremendous experience regarding biodiversity, but meeting the biodiversity challenges has to remain proportionate with the footprint of the mini-grids, actually. And same goes for cultural heritage. So these will be examined also through as many case studies as possible, and we welcome also the contribution and exchanges between participants. We will also come up with practical real-life situation in different countries regarding waste and end-of-life management of equipment. Obviously, it's all well and good to say, well, I'd love all my batteries to be recycled, but is it really possible, and what is actually available in the remote area I'm working in? Different countries are at different stages. I believe that Kenya is pretty advanced, so we will be also illustrating this through the case study of Kenya, trying to take inspiration as to what could be various approaches to waste and end-of-life management. As regards waste, of course, we also have to make sure that during the construction phase, all our service providers and contractors have a proper waste management process. The final session will then be on the operationalization challenges of ESG. This whole challenge of reporting. During the consultation phase, the feedback that we got from quite a few developers was that, first of all, getting the various financiers to agree was a bit of a problem. And so reporting through different templates is a challenge. So we try and highlight this. Of course, we can only provide suggestions and a kind of a template, which maybe as a developer, you can take up as a sort of a starting point and say, hey guys, can we sort of all agree on this common reporting template? In the reporting templates, we'll also try and explore how we avoid having two different absolutely separate series of reporting streams between impact reporting, operational reporting, and ESG reporting. Trying also to minimize the fact that all of a sudden, to give a very simplistic example, if after 2 or 3 years one has to have a specific gender-based reporting, well, actually for such a small mini-grid, if right at the start we had reporting through the community liaison officer or through the customer manager on issues related to gender, we may not need to actually have a specific study and a specific consultant expensive coming in later down the line. The other point we'll very much look into in this operationalization issue is through experience sharing and case studies, see how human resources can be managed. Again, consultants cost a lot in proportion to the income of a mini-grid, and below a certain size, it's difficult to have specialists. So how can we, through one officer who will be managing a cluster, who will be having effective tools, make sure that actually ESG and maximization of impact is actually built into the company culture for the global benefit of mini-grids, the company culture and all the human resources, technicians and others working within the company. So human resources and capacity building will be addressed during that last session in terms of experience sharing, because of course, there's no miracle recipe. I mean, if there were one, I guess all of us would know it. And then a discussion on the road ahead to enhancing impact and development of outcomes, and also the multiplication of mini-grid programs and the development of actually portfolios of mini-grid programs, which is basically what everybody is after, because the discrete unit cost of having expensive systems for tiny mini-grids just won't allow us to go very far. So this issue will also be addressed during session number 4, which will be on June 26th. So this is just to give you a little bit of a teaser as to what the training sessions are going to be all about in English. And I won't go more into the details of these sessions. I'll maybe hand over to Ines from ARE and maybe tell you a little bit about the target audience first. I'm sorry about that. I had forgotten this. So target audience. As you've seen, these toolkits are not research documents nor university documents. They really aim at being practical, targeting developers, targeting company managers, because the developers sometimes are those who actually will be operating the mini-grid systems or who will be managing the companies which manage those mini-grids. And we target also operators. So we really want to be as practical as possible and for practitioners. The basic message being that we try and give easy guidance for level 1 essentials, and then we can grow the complexity, refine once the portfolio grows. We also target financiers because, as was said in the introduction, a lot of these ESG guidance and compliance were basically written looking at large-scale programs with larger risks. I mean, we all know about the challenges of population displacement, large-scale hydro, biodiversity issues in large plantations, and so on and so forth. Here we have to think in proportion to the potential negative impact of those mini-grids, and really hopefully try and focus on the positive convergence and not only on the negative and the compliance, and you're not seeing it only as a burden. So we would really welcome financiers to also join in the dialogue with the developers and practitioners in the field, and maybe, help work together with us on these, simple and common reporting templates. What are the actually important KPIs? Not to say that we are downgrading our expectations in terms of environmental and social compliance, but just to make sure that the questions are asked and the reporting is done in such a way that it is basically consistent with the impact of those mini-grids. Regulators and all partners are, of course, really welcome because different countries have reached different levels in terms of national regulation. So having an exchange of views would obviously be more. We hope to have a series of guidance and toolkits that everybody can navigate through, which will reach the goal of being proportionate, practical, and built to reduce cost and risk over time, and obviously to achieve the impacts that we want to achieve in terms of access to energy in rural Africa. So with this, maybe I hand over to Ines. Please, Ines, in terms of how you could enroll for these trainings.
Thank you, Anjali. Hi, everyone. Indeed, as Anjali mentioned, these trainings are hands-on and really practical oriented. So we will accept only a maximum of 20 participants per module. ARE will send to all participants of this webinar an email where you will find a link, a survey, where you will be able to express your interest in participating in this training. So please fill it in, and then we will contact you if you're one of the selected participants. Do note that if you're not selected, in any case, you will have access to all materials, the toolkit and the manual, on the ESG Hub, project hub that is on the ARE website. The recording of this webinar will also be there on this project hub. So we will, in any case, share as many material as possible. But to participate in this training, there will be a link to fill it in, and you will receive that just after this webinar via email. So thanks already for participating in this training. So back to you for the question, the Q&A, Anjali.
Thank you very much, Ines, for guiding us through this. We are now looking at the questions and answers which were put in the chat. Let me first take the one question, which is which ESG framework has been adopted for this undertaking? This was a big challenge right at the start of the exercise, where clearly the mandate given to us by the African Development Bank and the IFC was to avoid sticking only to one framework. The whole idea there, and this is what we did, we reviewed all the existing frameworks and those which were most widely used to basically then suggest an approach which would be acceptable to the broader international financial community. And it was actually found that there is a convergence with these 8 or 10 standards of the African Development Bank. And this is then what we basically focused on. I don't know, Gabriele, if you are still online, whether you would like to add something in terms of, you know, how we worked regarding the standards, and that the whole idea is that this toolkit should not be specific to one standard in as much as possible.
Yes, thank you, Anjali. Yes, no, I think what we discussed was to really have as a starting point, clearly the integrated safeguard system that AfDB is applying, and clearly also the IFC performance standards, since these are really the most widely and most broadly used E&S standards. We also note that many of the other investors and financiers, impact investors, DFIs, have adopted primarily the IFC performance standards, and maybe also adapted a little bit, but that a lot of the different standards are based on these bigger ones. And clearly, as Anjali said, there was also a little bit the objective with this guidance material to, as far as possible, comply with a wide range of the requirements of different investors and financiers. So, but I think to start with, because many financiers are using standards that are based on IFC performance standards, and of course there is the AfDB ISS. So these are the core standards that we were looking, and we were really trying to develop guidance on to better understand, to implement and to comply with those standards. I hope this helps a bit, Anjali. Back to you for the next question.
Yes, thank you very much, Gabriele. Let me now take another question, which is a little bit on the same theme. If I get you correctly from one of the slides, does it mean that all projects of size less than 1 megawatt don't necessarily require a full ESMS? Now, this is you hit the nail on the head in terms of one of the key challenges that we want to address. I think what we can say is that all sites and all clusters require a full ESMS in the sense that all these 7 building blocks that we showed have to be addressed. But what we really realized in doing this very wide stakeholder engagement is that, what do you call a full ESMS? A full, very detailed biodiversity assessment, for example. Now, this will obviously require a specialist and will be very costly. So this is the screening that basically Marine presented to you earlier. The idea is that to avoid having to do a full ESMS in that sense of the word, which would be too costly, we then basically exclude those sites. But nonetheless, we have the building blocks of each one of the steps of the ESMS. You have to do your risk assessment. You have to formulate your management plans for each one of the risks which have been identified. But we also know that a full ESMS, in that sense of the word, is not affordable for a small mini grid. So I hope that this helps in terms of answering your question. We definitely do not see that all mini grids, given the potential risk and negative impacts that they have, not all of them will require full specialist reports for everything, because it's just not reasonable given the economics of what mini grids and mini grid clusters are all about. So I hope that this this helps on the ESMS and the approach. Nonetheless, it means it obviously does not release us from the fact that we have to go through all the steps of the ESMS. Now, a follow-up. Sorry, there is a follow-up question on the ESG framework, which is the focus more on financial materiality, or are you considering both financial impact and materiality? I'm really sorry, I don't really understand this follow-up question, and I'm sorry you don't have access to the mic, but could you please reformulate what you mean through that question on the ESG framework? Okay, so a very technical question. When the site is up and running, is it acceptable to sell excess power to the national grid as a way of boosting revenue? I would answer obviously yes, from a general point of view. I mean, why should it not be acceptable? The only reason why it would not be acceptable would depend on national regulations. The possibility of actually selling to the main grid depends, number one, on whether the main grid is close by. Number two, on whether this is allowed by national regulations. And number three, whether the offtake contract, price, etc., is something which makes it attractive for you as a mini grid developer to sell excess power to the grid. So for us, from the perspective of a mini grid, there's absolutely no issue and no problem in selling excess power to the main grid. In terms of regulatory framework, here we are talking actually beyond the ESG issue per se. I think that as mini grid developers, what we have seen in many instances is that we are given an authorization and allowed to develop a mini grid with the sort of a moral guarantee or even a signed document saying that the main grid will not arrive before 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years and connect the population. The problem is that quite frequently this does happen, and the mini grid developer, even though he has a paper, etc., ends up with a loss and a sunk asset. So in that sense, we are actually in some work that we do also with regulators, trying to discuss with regulators that, okay, one cannot preclude the fact that the grid may arrive, but it's only fair that there is a regulatory framework which basically defines and formulates how the mini grid would be allowed to sell power to the main grid. So basically remain a power generator, possibly a local distributor, but compensated for his investment. So this is the answer more from, let's say, our practitioners' experience and not really within this documentation on ESG that we are developing at this point in time. We then have another question, and there I would welcome also input from Marine and Gabriele. The question is, to what extent does the land ownership process and government approval prepare operators to address site compliance issues? I guess that the first step in any case is that we have to comply with national regulations, and we have to see, what are the requirements of the national authorities in terms of land ownership and compensation. This is basically the absolute minimum requirement and approval. Then what we have to assess is whether the requirements of the national regulatory process are considered being sufficient from the frameworks which your international funder would like you to implement. The requirements may be higher, and therefore the national regulation would just be considered as a first step. So it also may happen that in terms of the risks related to indigenous people, the gray area related to traditional land ownership, we end up feeling that this would require a specialist study and would be too expensive for a mini grid, in which case we have to look at the situation objectively and see whether this would lead to excluding the site, or whether we still feel that with additional resources, we could reach the compliance standards that your international financier may require. But maybe Gabriele or Marine, you would like to add something onto this question?
I think I leave the responses to the experts. So, Marine.
I think you've given the right answer, Angeli. This document is really to prepare you and prepare your assessment. And if that, let's say, as we said, it will never replace completely the kind of more granular document that may be asked by the government, etc. So, but it will help you do this kind of first approach, first exercise, first screening, etc. That will really help you get through perhaps a more difficult project or process. So really take it as something like as your friend, as the friend who will always be advising you. But of course, bring more expertise if needed. And if since this conversation was really about land, really join the session that is on land. If I'm not mistaken, it's going to be session 3.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Marine, for these clarifications. Okay, so now I have the clarification question, which is now very clear for me. Is the adopted ESG framework investor focus, or will it also cover the impact on society and environment? Absolutely, 100%. It is not only investor focused, but it will cover impact for the society and for the environment. This is the whole idea of this toolkit and the guidance document, is that we don't want to be just in this tick the box exercise for financiers, which will then make financiers happy in that sense, and allow them to disperse the funds. This is not a very constructive approach. And what we have tried to illustrate through this webinar, and we'll go more deeply in it through the trainings, is that there really is a win-win situation. If you use this ESG framework in a practical way, implementing it will increase the impact of your mini-grid. So the economic success for the mini-grid developer who needs customers, but even more important, the social impact, meaning improved standards of living for the targeted population, leading also to social and productive uses, working together in this ESG philosophy where your community in terms of governance feels that they have some kind of an ownership. And we also definitely feel that implementing this guidance driven by the ESG approach will really be a great support in ensuring the environmental sustainability and waste management of the mini-grids. So this whole exercise, I would say, aims at changing the mindset of ESG from just a constraining and compliance exercise to something which really contributes to long-term environmental and social sustainability, but it also has to be practical and affordable for the mini-grid developers. So this was this question. Now, what questions do we have remaining? The last one there is not related to the webinar. Based on your experience, what are the African countries that have succeeded in establishing a sustainable market? Oh, can you go lower? I can't read. A sustainable market for solar-based mini-grids that don't rely on grants from development partners. Yeah, well, that's a really challenging one. I would like to take a step back. I mean, if we look at rural infrastructure at large, and basically rural electrification at large, in basically any country in the world, rural infrastructure has required government support in one way or the other. So public-private partnership means, in the way that I understand it, and there I'm giving you a personal interpretation, means that in some instances, we feel that the private sector is more effective and efficient in implementing certain things. But if we say that we don't need grants, whether from the international community or some kind of public support for mini-grids, or more broadly for rural electrification, I think to some extent this is an illusion, because in such remote areas, people cannot afford to pay the actual real price of electricity. So in one way or the other, either starting from the international donor community, but then slowly graduating to national frameworks through cross-subsidization of sorts, rural electrification, remote area support will always require public finance. I mean, even in Europe, when you talk about electrifying in remote mountainous areas where you have scattered population, the electricity is not priced at real cost. So we just had one last question, the first one, if you can go up there. Okay. Gender and social inclusion, GESI, is a critical component of mini-grid development in Africa. Whether you think about access to energy, productive utilization, there is certainly a school. My question is, what data do you have on these GESI issues? Is this documented or given visibility in your various initiatives? Is there room to develop this further? The GESI issue, just to answer, came up very regularly in the consultations that we had but I personally am not aware of any specific studies regarding GESI and mini-grid issues. I don't know, Gabriele, whether you are aware of any specific studies or whether the IFC has conducted specific studies regarding gender and social inclusion in the mini-grid sector, or whether we would have to explore that further and maybe come back to you whether in that related session.
Yes, I think I'm also not aware, not on top of my head, that there is a specific study, doesn't come to mind, but we can take this question further and investigate, because also at the AfDB we have a very dedicated gender department, so we can definitely look into this.
Okay, so with this, I would like to thank you all for your participation. I mean, the questions have been very interesting. We've had lots of participation and are really happy. We hope that you found this interesting. And please do register for all or one or two of the training sessions given your specific interest. So with this, I would like to really thank you all for your participation and wishing you all a very good day and all success in further implementing your mini-grid projects. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.